Great. Welcome, everybody, particularly on a day with sunshine, which always is a lure to the outdoors. My name is Professor Chris Alden, and I'm a professor of international relations and director of LSE Ideas. I'd like to welcome you here. We've got some distinguished speakers. We have an audience that is in the room and also an audience online. So we're really speaking hybrid in its fullest sense. And we welcome all of you to this event. This is an event that's co-hosted by the Contemporary Turkish Studies Department and the LSE Ideas, Turkey and the World project in particular, which Dr. Susler's in charge of. And before I'd like to start with our introductions of the speakers, I would like to just say a few things that really are sort of housekeeping things. This event is being recorded. It's going to be available as a podcast. It's also going to be available as a video. For Twitter users, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Turkey. Once our panelists have finished their presentations, you'll be able to ask questions. As we're doing this online, we do have to have the usual protocols that come with online. And so please, if you're the online audience, if you're amongst them, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and include your name and affiliation. And for those of you who are in the room, I'll let you know when we can open to the floor for questions there. And please raise your hand and the stewards will bring a mic to you. I want to ensure a range of questions, both from our online audience and our audience in the room, once our speakers are done with their initial presentations. And finally, we'll have a drinks reception at the end and hope that if you're able to stay, that you can join us for that. So I'm very pleased to be welcoming our prominent speakers for this exploration of the consequences of 6 February 2023 earthquakes for Turkish society, politics, and foreign policy. As you know, 2 earthquakes of 7.6 and 7.8 magnitude caused a major disaster in Turkey and in neighboring Syria. In Turkey, more than 50,000 people died. We tend to forget these things, and it's really, profound in terms of the deaths, and 2.5 million people have been displaced. The earthquake's economic loss and burden are estimated to be the equivalent of 8% of Turkey's GDP. So I'm going to announce all our speakers now and then turn it to our first speaker, who will come up here to speak. First speakers, of course, Dr. Yaprak Gürsoy, a professor of European politics and chair of contemporary Turkish studies here at the LSE. She will address what the extent to which earthquakes made an impact on the May 23rd, 2023 general elections. Our second speaker, Uzga Zineoğlu, is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Liverpool. She will discuss how civil society and state-society relations were influenced by the earthquake and the subsequent relief effects. And our third speaker is Dr. Buğra Susler, who's a lecturer at UCL in the Department of Political Science and a visiting fellow at LSE Ideas, who will examine Turkish foreign policy and how that's been impacted as a result of the expressions of solidarity and otherwise by international community. So each speaker has 15 minutes for their intervention, and then once that's complete, we'll start with a Q&A. So first, go for it.
Hope everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation. It's tricky a little bit to do these types of hybrid events. Thank you very much, Arzu, for keeping everything in order and for helping us with the organization of this event as usual. So let me also time myself because I have too many slides and I don't want to go over. So today my responsibility is to talk about the impact of the earthquakes on the Turkish elections and the May 2023 elections. Why is this not working? Okay, so I will be presenting the preliminary results of our project. The project is entitled Okay, it's sometimes working, it's sometimes not working. Ama olmadı, olmadı. Tamam, okay. So this is going to work. Okay. So this is a project that we are doing with Dr. Buğra Güngör. This is another Buğra, not the same Buğra. I'm working with two different Buğras, which can also get confusing in my mind. Both of them brilliant academics, by the way. And Friedrich Putman, who is a PhD candidate at LSE. And this project was supported by the LSE Urgency Grant. And it is based on a public opinion survey, which was conducted before the elections, 2 weeks before the elections, with 2,811 face-to-face interviews, and the sample is representative of Turkish society in general. If you want to know more about the project, you can visit our website, where we talk a little bit about the project and the reasons why we're conducting it. Now, of course, you all know the results of the elections. So these are the results of the presidential elections. In the first round, 4 candidates ran and Erdogan came on top with 49.52% of the vote, but didn't make the 50% threshold. The second runner-up was Kılıçdaroğlu, and so they ran in the second round of elections again, and there Erdogan won 52% of the votes, and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the opposition candidate, got around 48% of the votes. Now, before the elections, the expectation, even much before the elections, right after the earthquake, the expectation was that the earthquakes would impact the election outcomes. And there was an expectation that this would have a negative impact on Erdogan and AKP votes. There are some academic studies that would support this thesis, obviously, that mismanagement of natural disasters, for instance, also the COVID-19 pandemic, but other weather-related disasters usually cost officers who are elected their offices. So this was the expectation, and there was also an expectation because of the aftermath of the 1999 earthquake in Turkey and the fall of the entire political party system 3 years after that. But if you look at the second round of election results by region, you can, of course, the result was that the AKP and Erdogan won the elections. And if you look at the second round election results by region, you can see that the earthquake zone actually voted voted for Erdogan with a majority. If you compare the election results, this is very crude analysis, obviously very descriptive. But if you look at the results of the June 2018 elections and the May 2023 elections, if you put all of the opposition candidates together, they amount to the same vote that the opposition got 5 years later. And Erdogan's vote in this presidential election in 2018 and 2023 is almost exactly the same. So what we're witnessing is a situation that there was no change in Erdogan or AKP voters. Despite the earthquakes, the question then becomes, why was there no change in the election results, even in the earthquake regions? And the simple answer that I'm going to try to show to you today is that pre-established party perceptions influenced how the earthquakes were interpreted by voters and by society. This pre-established identity, political party identity and affiliation is sometimes referred to as affective polarization or affective attachments in politics. There's a growing literature on the impact of affective polarization in, for instance, American politics and also in other Western societies. We see something similar in Turkey as well. People are attached to the AKP, emotionally attached, so they're affectively attached. and they are also attached to President Erdogan and their support for him. So in our public opinion survey, which we conducted in late April, we asked, is there a political party you would not give up voting for under any circumstances? So this is just one example from a question and a table that demonstrates that for 27% of the population in a representative sample, so we are assuming because the sample is representative for the population as well, for 27% approximately, they would never give up voting for AK Party and Erdogan's political party under any circumstances. We have 12% for the main opposition party, CHP. So this demonstrates that under any circumstances, the AKP would be able to get 27% of the votes, no matter what. And in fact, in the general parliamentary elections, what they did was to get an additional 10%. And the CHP did the same thing. They got an additional approximately 10% in the 2018 elections. In this time around, it was slightly higher, but that's the core vote that they are kind of adding to their voter base. Now, what is significant is that people who are supportive of the AKP and who are supportive of Erdogan as well wouldn't change their minds even if an earthquake happens. What they see is that the interpretation of the earthquake and what happens during the earthquake and afterwards is interpreted from the lens of their support for their favorite political party. So this is again just one example. There are other tables as well, because I would run out of time. I've just included this table. How would you rate the disaster management of the government? This is what we asked to our respondents. If you look at all the respondents, you can say that for approximately half of them, the disaster management of the government was poor, very bad or bad. So total was 46%. But those who voted for the AKP in the previous elections in 2018, it was only 11% that they thought that the management of the earthquake was poor. And you see the majority, a very clear majority of 75% who voted for the AKP in the previous elections, saying that the government's disaster management was actually good, very good to good. There's a striking contrast, and that means that your party perceptions would impact how you viewed disaster management and what happens after the earthquakes. So this explains slightly the insignificant influence of the earthquakes on the election results, as we have also seen through other tables. But that doesn't mean that the impact of the earthquakes possibly was zero. There are clues in the data. We haven't really examined it yet. So these are only descriptive tables. We need to do more research, obviously. But we can see that there are differences among those who have experienced losses due to the earthquakes. So before I move on to the tables where I show how, whether a person has experienced loss or not impacted their voting intentions, I would like to show you our poll data on 14 May election prediction, when undecided voters were distributed proportionally, was actually very close to the real outcome. I'm showing this to you because there was a lot of debate with the polling companies and their predictions, just to, confirm that the sample is actually quite good, and it is representative of, or we believe it is to be representative of Turkish society, because the actual results were very similar to this outcome from our survey. So we also asked in our survey to the respondents, have you lost any of the following due to the earthquakes? An acquaintance, a relative, your house, a family member. So the approximate number of people who have experienced some sort of loss, an acquaintance is of course an outside circle, kind of somebody that you know. It's around 21%. And this is something that we would estimate to be correct in Turkish society too, because the region inhabited 16 million people. So we would, 16% of the Turkish population. So we would expect 16% of the population in Turkey to have lost someone, and then with the outer circle, 21% sounds reasonable to us. So again, we believe that this data is reliable. So combining those two, the loss in the earthquake, the experience of loss in the earthquake, and voting intentions, we can see important differences. So among those, this is among those who voted for the AKP in the 2018 elections again. Remember, these are people who mostly viewed the performance of the government to be good. Okay, so they already have some sort of, the majority of them at least have some sort of positive view. Those who experience no loss, combined with, of course, affective attachments, emotional attachment to the party, 81% said that they would vote for the AKP again. But those who experienced the loss said only 69% of them said that they will vote for the AKP again. Now, you can interpret this data in two different ways. They've experienced loss, but still 69%, almost 70% of them will vote for the AKP again. But then again, the second type of interpretation is compared with people who haven't experienced the loss, there is a huge difference. There is a difference of 12 points, okay? So people who've experienced the loss, who really, truly suffered from the earthquakes, were thinking about who to vote for. There was a chance for them to go to the CHP. So the difference between people who have voted for the AKP in 2018 and who would vote for the CHP now is only 4%. But for those who've experienced loss, there was a higher chance for them to vote for the CHP. So there was a chance for them to vote or to be inclined toward the opposition, we can assume precisely because of their loss in the earthquakes. What is interesting in this data is the undecided vote share. There is an increase in the undecided vote share among those people who have experienced loss as well. So if the opposition could have been more successful, potentially they could have added to the 7% and that this 11% as well. But we know that that did not happen. Now, if we look at the general population, not just the AKP voters, what we see is the situation. We ask what it was the, who would you vote for in the May 14 elections? Erdogan or Kılıçdaroğlu. So this is not party vote, this is presidential election vote. And then we can see that respondents, why is this not working? No, it's working. I'm trying to find the red dots. I don't know if you can, guys can see the red dots. Okay, there it is. Okay, so people who have faced the loss, experienced the loss, they were inclined to vote for Kılıçdaroğlu, but not Erdogan. So among this population with a loss, Kılıçdaroğlu was ahead. Again, look at the undecideds. So there were 12% of people who were undecided. So these are not only AKP voters, but the voters in general, among the general public. Respondents without a loss, of course, this is very similar to the result because the undecided voters haven't been distributed. There's a 5-point difference between Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu, which is actually the election result, as we know from the 14th of May. So there is no change there, obviously, but you can see the contrast between those who experience loss and those who haven't experienced loss. This, I think, is important because we have a tendency to think they've lost so much in that region, but they're still voting for the AKP. This is not entirely true. We need a more nuanced approach to understand the full dynamic here. And beyond the data, how to interpret these more. I mean, I've already talked about affective polarization and emotional attachment to political parties. But we need to also acknowledge that institutions, that includes obviously media, political parties, and other institutions, they produce narratives of disasters. This happens everywhere in the world. After a disaster, a natural disaster or a human-made disaster, there is always a narrative of some sort. So exposure to these conflicting narratives matter. Where you got the news, who you listened to, who you spoke with also matter. What I find is quite interesting is that the Kılıçdaroğlu campaign did not address government failures during the earthquakes. And as we have seen, there was actually some sort of potential for them to get the undecided voters. And if they could have explained perhaps, what happens after the earthquakes a little bit better, they could have done better in the election results as well. But they didn't do it. We also need to acknowledge that a strong leader can give more confidence in times of need. So performance of the government, especially after the earthquakes, is significantly better in the region. We need to also understand that after some failures in the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes, the government was actually doing better, significantly better in the recent months. And government's promises of rebuilding houses was probably understood to be viable and real. And finally, we need to also understand that this is the short-run impact, but the long-run impact of the earthquakes with the economy, with the social dynamics, it could be different because people need time to process the pain and also the information and trauma. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank LSE Ideas and the chair of the Contemporary Turkish Studies for their kind invitation. It's great to be here with you today. Now, when we discuss disasters and civil society, we tend to focus on the post-earthquake efforts of the NGOs, who mobilized, how they mobilized, what went wrong, what did they do efficiently. What is less talked about is the impact of the actual earthquake on the NGOs, on the civil society. But this is a relevant and I think equally important question because, for those of you who would remember or know, the Marmara earthquake in 1999 was one of the turning points in the recent history of civil society in Turkey. The work done by the NGOs then, or in the immediately after the earthquake, changed the public perception towards civil society, increased their visibility, and elevated them as a rising actor, along with other developments at the time. So I think it's important that we discuss how such a major disaster in Turkey affected and can affect civil society in Turkey. Of course, it's not easy to understand the full impact of the earthquakes on civil society, while only a few months have passed since the earthquake. That's why I thought of actually dividing the discussion into three parts. First, I would speak about what the earthquake actually showed us about the civil society in Turkey, and then what we would have liked to see with the civil society, but maybe we could not. And finally, the potential long-term effects of the earthquake on civil society. Now, the earthquake on its own is an extremely disruptive catastrophe, but even a disaster at such a large scale, we cannot think of it independently from the societal and political dynamics in the country, such as the current events like the elections. So while I'm discussing these, I will be making references to the elections or other societal and political dynamics in Turkey. So firstly, what did the earthquake show, or what did we see in civil society in the short term after the earthquakes? The civil society became incredibly active. They became incredibly active in a very short period of time. There was a sudden outburst of aid and volunteers. Shortly after the earthquake, there was a presidential decree issued that allowed the NGOs, the associations and foundations to be able to, that allowed them to to work in disaster-related activities and collect aid, regardless of their status, purpose, or scope of work. Previously, normally NGOs are allowed to do that only if it's part of their scope of their work. In addition, there was obviously the people's urge to do something. So as a result, what we saw that there was an immense, incredible material and non-material aid transfer to the region, to the NGOs working in the region. Search and rescue, and especially humanitarian aid, are probably the areas that have developed the most in the past 10-15 years in Turkey. Some of them even became internationalized. So these NGOs working on, charities working on these areas, they quickly, rapidly mobilized and went to the area. But it was not only these organizations, these NGOs, but other groups, other organizations flexed their work areas, and they also went to the region, or they started supporting the search and rescue and humanitarian aid from where they are, from other cities across the country. At the same time, there was an incredible army of volunteers supporting the work of the NGOs. Hundreds of people went to the earthquake zone. Many more supported the collection and distribution and coordination of aid from different parts of the country. And finally, apart from the NGOs, we've seen the mobilization or establishment of many citizen initiatives to meet the needs of the earthquake survivors. What we've seen was a very good example of what active citizenship means. Now, what does this mobilization show us? It shows that how advanced the reflexes of civil society in Turkey has become in the past 20 years, especially in terms of being able to organize in the face of disasters. We had actually seen this in the COVID-19 pandemic, and partly so during the refugee crisis as well. A part of civil society in Turkey has reached the point where they can respond quickly to crises and disasters. They can organize themselves, they can mobilize the society and aid very rapidly. So this is the glass, let's say, half full. The empty side of the glass is a bit more complex, because even in such a large-scale disaster, we cannot think of it independently of the general political and social conditions in Turkey. Firstly, yes, the government flexed, expanded the scope of civil society activity by relaxing, for instance, the law on aid collection, which is pretty much restricted. But there was direct or indirect pressure applied to certain individuals, certain groups, certain organizations that were seen as rivals to the government, or that grew so much that they could be seen as challenges to the public institutions. I'll give one example only. Take Ahbap, for instance. For those of you who don't know, Ahbap is a charitable organization. It was established quite recently in 2017 by a philanthropist and a musician, Halit Levent. It's a charity on mutual aid and solidarity. It was pretty well known even before the earthquake, but with the earthquake or after the earthquakes, it's become one of the leading organizations, charities collecting and distributing aid to the earthquake zone. They collected in a matter of a couple of months, they collected around 850 million Turkish liras. With the currency rate of that time, it is roughly about 40 million British pounds. Just to put it in context, the associations are the main bulk of organized civil society in Turkey. In the year 2021, all the associations in Turkey collected roughly slightly over 2 billion British pounds. So Ahbap on its own, in a matter of a couple of months, could raise something like 40 million pounds. This is a lot, but it was also much higher compared to what some government agencies, or what we call GONGOs, government organized non-governmental organizations, could collect after the earthquake as well. What followed this was high-level political figures such as Minister of Interior, or the then Minister of Interior, or the leader of the coalition partner party, they started expressing their reactions and even issuing threats to Ahbap, but other individuals and organizations raising funds as well. Of course, we cannot think of these developments independently of the election atmosphere that Turkey was entering gradually at the time. Although, I mean, the government's responsibility in the destruction of in that destruction was evident. The growth of NGOs, to the extent that they could be considered equivalent or even rival to the government, to the public institutions such as AFAD, the Disaster and Emergency Management Presidency, it was challenging the government's narrative that there is destruction here, yes, but we are the only ones who can provide a solution or who can fix this. The government agreed for the NGOs, charities to show some small local initiatives, but it also wanted to be seen as the quote unquote, the savior. In fact, this was one of the main electoral promises of the AKP in the region. And of course, an NGO like Ahbap that builds container cities to provide shelter to thousands of people becomes a competitor, a challenge against that narrative, against that goal. Another important issue is the highly polarized environment in Turkey. Disasters inevitably force NGOs or charities or civil society organizations in general to work together. In the past decade or so, certain groups within civil society, certain civic activists, they've actually learned to operate together. They learn to cooperate. They learn to complement one another. There are some very good examples to that. For instance, the disaster platform. But all these initiatives, very successful initiatives actually, are still politically divided. They don't see each other. They don't interact with each other, they meaning across the political or ideological divide. After the earthquake, we have seen some collaborations, a number of collaborations, but they were made selectively without that comprehensive perspective. I haven't seen a concerted effort where that comprehensive coordination among NGOs was being established. Of course, the elections have further sharpened this divide. The NGOs close to the government disregarded the responsibility of the government or the state, or they didn't want to speak about discuss the shortcomings, discuss the mistakes. Even the charitable aid became polarized, depending on where you stand ideologically or which political party you're supporting. It would show which charity you would be giving your charitable aid, or whether you're giving to a charity or a government agency. So polarization manifested itself in this context as well. While all this was happening, what I observed was that civil society could not seize the opportunity to see the earthquake as a chance to address and discuss its own problems, its own limitations. In fact, earthquake was a very good opportunity, very important opportunity for civil society in Turkey to bring up and to discuss some long-standing issues, such as sustainable fundraising, such as volunteerism, empowerment of local NGOs, cooperation of civic organizations between local and national. So these issues became prominent. I mean, fundraising was the issue. Volunteers were pouring in hundreds and in large numbers, but it was a very good opportunity to raise and discuss these issues, both within civil society, but also with the public and with the state institutions as well. That crucial moment, I think, passed, and I believe this opportunity was not utilized by civil society. Now, I would like to move on for a few minutes on the possible future impacts that we can see from here, because the impact of the earthquake and post-earthquake aid and efforts will continue, although they may become less visible for us. The impacts, we will see the impacts will carry on to the future from here. For example, one important issue is the anticipated international aid assistance coming to Turkey. And we expect that the potentially larger contributions will come from the UN agencies and Europe. The total pledge of International Donors Conference, if you followed, it was 7 billion euros, of which slightly over 6 billion euros will come to Turkey. Of this, 4.3 billion euros will be loans for Turkey's reconstruction, and about 1.75 billion euros will be in grants. The terms and conditions of these are, as much as I can follow, are not yet clear, but we can expect that some, like in the refugee crisis, some of this money will be distributed through civil society. Now, the influx of such large amounts of money can have both positive and negative effects on the whole ecosystem of civil society, and it's important for us, for the donors, funders, for the civil society, for the state to consider the potential harms that can arise from such situations. One of the challenges, I'm not going to go into detail of all of them, but one of the challenges associated with such a sudden influx of money is the potential for an unsustainable growth of civil society in general, but also of the individual NGOs, of the individual organizations themselves. Now, when a significant amount of funding becomes available, what can happen is numerous organizations may emerge to address the needs of the populations. This can lead to a crowded landscape where NGOs and other organizations will compete for limited resources. They can potentially duplicate efforts. But another problem is the sudden expansion of individual NGOs within civil society, creating perhaps certain hierarchies between the organizations. Of course, when there's a sudden expansion, the related risk is that there would be a sudden contraction of civil society once the funds are depleted, leaving sometimes fragmented and even weakened civil society. We should also remember that external aid often comes with certain demands. Donors and funders may prioritize short-term output-oriented activities that yield immediate and tangible results. And these may not necessarily address the long-term needs and challenges of the affected populations. For instance, immediate relief efforts are essential, like providing clothing and food, but these may overshadow the long-term projects that address the profound effects of the earthquake on the individuals, on the cities, on the communities, on the society at large. So it's crucial for civil society to take a more comprehensive and multidimensional approach when addressing the needs of the community, when taking up these funds. Finally, and perhaps in summary, it may be too early to see the full impact of the earthquake, the February earthquakes on civil society. But what we've seen is that what earthquake showed us is that, on the one hand, it's learned a great deal from the previous disasters. So it's a learning community, actually, Turkish civil society. But on the other hand, it's still greatly influenced by the political and social dynamics in Turkey. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about the foreign policy and international cooperation aspect. And following the earthquakes, more than 80 countries delivered aid, and thousands of foreign rescue and search and rescue teams were helping Turkey. The question that I'm addressing in this panel is whether Turkish foreign policy has changed as a result of expressions of international solidarity. And my short answer to that is no. So it hasn't really changed, I think, as a result of expressions of international solidarity. So I would agree with this insignificant impact of the earthquake idea. But that's just a short answer. And long answer is that I think earthquakes or natural disasters in general provide opportunities to pursue improvements in bilateral relations and to mend broken ties. But I think it all comes down to whether there is political will. So I think it's important to look at the notion of earthquake diplomacy. So I'll do that first, talk about earthquake diplomacy and go back to 1999 as well. And then I'll move on to some general observations about foreign policy trends that I think will continue in Erdogan's new term as president. So the term earthquake diplomacy in the context of Greek-Turkish relations can be traced back to the 1999 earthquakes in Turkey and Greece after the 17th August 1999 earthquake in Turkey, which killed over 18,000 people, according to the official figures. Greece offered aid, and then Turkey welcomed the aid, accepted the aid, and then less than a month later, there was another earthquake in Greece, and then Turkey reciprocated. And earthquake diplomacy at the time, it helped improve bilateral relationship between Turkey and Greece. As politicians at the time emphasized closer relations, friendship, despite ongoing conflict and disputes. So they improved public perceptions of bilateral relations. It was also a reminder of we're sharing the same neighborhood. What happened to you today might happen to me tomorrow, so we can put our differences aside and cooperate. However, it's also important to note that at the time, Turkey-Greece rapprochement was made possible by mutual political will to cooperate on the basis of mutual interests, and key people like foreign ministers Cem and Papandreou really worked hard to make this happen, actively collaborated to make it happen. So it was not just a direct result of earthquakes, but there was also a political will to achieve a rapprochement at the time. So after the earthquakes this year, we again saw headlines that read earthquake diplomacy. Greek foreign minister visited Turkey, disaster areas, met Turkish foreign minister Çavuşoğlu, and lots of references to 1999 earthquake diplomacy. And they both expressed a desire to improve bilateral relations. And following the earthquakes in Turkey, this term earthquake diplomacy was also used in the context of potential improvements in Turkey-Armenia relations. For example, after 3 decades, the Turkey-Armenia border was opened to allow Armenian aid to go into Turkey. Prime Minister of Armenia visited Turkey last week, attended Erdogan's inauguration ceremony, and he was accompanied by Armenia's special envoy for normalization of relations with Turkey. So while these developments, I think, offer optimism, the main question remains as to whether earthquake diplomacy can contribute to long-term prospects of a long-term rapprochement or long-term softening of tensions. I think it definitely helps if there is an existing political will to improve relations. And in the case of Turkey and Armenia, you can see that there is already an ongoing process of normalization. For example, last year, in March, Turkish and Armenian foreign ministers met at Antalya Diplomacy Forum and said in a joint press conference that they aimed for full normalization. So one can identify some political will in that context. So I think while international solidarity provides some optimism for cooperation, it's difficult to say that earthquakes alone can lead to long-lasting softening of tense relationships between rival powers. And if we look at the literature on disaster diplomacy, this can be earthquake diplomacy, volcano diplomacy, drought diplomacy, it tells us that humanitarian disasters can indeed provide a window of opportunity for rapprochement between rival states, and sometimes may open new windows of collaboration. However, historically, long-term impacts are rarely seen, and I'm a bit skeptical about long-term rapprochement. It does not directly result in changes, but can help improve relationships if there is also a political will to improve relationships. So in terms of some broader observations about Turkish foreign policy after the elections moving forward, trends in Turkish foreign policy, I'd like to identify a few areas. So in terms of Turkey's relations with the West, Turkey-EU relations, I don't really expect major changes in Turkey's relationship with the West. Turkey-EU relations in recent years have become very transactional, and migration deal is one example of that transactional relationship. And that's also an example of how contestation and cooperation may happen at the same time. The notion of conflictual cooperation is when you may have some tensions at the leadership level, but also some cooperation, functional cooperation in areas of mutual concern. I don't think there is any genuine interest from either side to keep the normative, ideational aspect of the accession process alive. So I think we will continue to see a transactional relationship and working partnership. And the EU sees Turkey as an important partner who can help the EU with border security and migration. And I think they're now used to negotiating with Erdogan. So I don't think that's a big issue. Migration deal was an example of how securing Turkey's cooperation was really essential for the EU, how the EU prioritized Turkey's cooperation, even if that came at the expense of EU's retreat from accession political membership conditionality. At the same time, I think another important issue is that Erdogan's government needs capital inflow to deal with the effects of the economic crisis. And for this reason, one might even expect a certain softening of Turkish rhetoric towards the West, I think. Ankara needs financing to deal with the economic crisis. It needs international financial markets to return to Turkey. And we'll see whether Ankara will approve Sweden's accession to NATO by the Vilnius summit. So Ankara needs money and investments. And that might also mean perhaps increased cooperation with other states like Gulf states or China. So what I expect to continue also in terms of broader foreign policy trends is this idea of a strategic autonomy. So pursuing strategic autonomy in Turkish foreign policy, pursuit of more influence both in international politics, but also in regional politics. That doesn't necessarily mean a move away from this Western orientation, but it means a pursuit of a more autonomous, more Turkey-centric foreign policy. And that's not really unique to Turkey. That's, I think, typical emerging middle power behavior as these powers seek status and more influence in international politics, while at the same time they contest structures, Western-oriented, Western-led international order, power structures in the international order. And they often frame themselves as bridge builders, and they try to identify areas of niche diplomacy. So Ankara has also pursued bridge building policies in some issue areas. And one clear example of that is Turkey's reaction to Russia-Ukraine war, that Turkey-centric sort of autonomous pursuit of autonomy. And most notably in this war, Ankara has tried to pursue a mediator role in line with its strategic interests. And Erdogan has often argued that Turkey is in a unique position to be a mediator in this conflict. And he pursued what he termed a policy of balance. And accordingly, Turkey provided aid to Ukraine, including military aid, drones, for example, but that also refused to put sanctions on Russia. So I think this policy of balance is something that is above party politics, because the opposition also said that they would pursue a policy of balance. And there are also historical reasons, background for that. It's not the first time Turkey is pursuing a policy of balance between Russia and the West. And in the war, I think Turkey has achieved some results in terms of mediation. It's in fact the only country that has achieved some results in terms of mediation in Russia-Ukraine war. Specifically, it played a key role in the grain deal, the deal that allows Ukraine to export grain across the Black Sea. And if you look at the details of the deal, it's not exactly between Russia and Ukraine, but it's rather between Russia and the mediators, EU and Turkey, and Ukraine and the mediators, EU and Turkey. So as a mediator, Turkey has assumed some responsibilities there, including inspection and monitoring. There are other examples as well. In September 2022, for example, there was an exchange of prisoners, and Turkey was, in the words of Ukrainian ambassador to Turkey, very helpful in that arrangement. And these prisoners remain in Turkey until the end of the war. Strategic autonomy also means pursuit of greater influence in regional and international politics. Turkey has become an important drone power, which is a niche area that Turkey has been investing in. And Ankara is not just selling drones to Ukraine only, but to other powers and African countries, for example, such as Ethiopia. In his Africa tour, Erdogan was quoted saying, "Everywhere I go in Africa, everyone asks about UAVs." So these can potentially generate economic as well as political influence for Ankara. And if you look at the attendance list of the inauguration ceremony of Erdogan, you'll see lots of African heads of states and many African leaders attended his ceremony. So I expect there to be a stronger emphasis on closer relations with African states, especially with African states Turkey shares historical ties with. And Professor Alvin and I will examine Turkey's relations with Africa and how Islam and the notion of Muslim fraternity have been used to pursue closer relations with some African states. And how African states can then use those shared discourses to pursue greater gains in negotiations. So I would expect that to continue. Turkey's new foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, used to be the chief of intelligence, also used to be the head of TİKA, which is the Turkish Cooperation Coordination Agency, provides development assistance in the developing world, and he has papers on Africa, Central Asia. So I expect that developing world dimension to continue, a stronger emphasis perhaps on the developing world. Another foreign policy trend that I observe is the increasing use of military instruments to achieve foreign policy objectives. So that is about projection of hard power in Turkey's neighborhood using military instruments of foreign policy. And if you look at the literature, recent literature that also emphasizes how hard power projection has become an important aspect of contemporary Turkish foreign policy, especially in the Middle East and in Turkey's neighborhood. Clearest examples are Turkey's involvement in the Libya war and support for the Tripoli government, and Turkish-made combat drones changed the direction of the conflict in that war and prevented General Haftar from capturing Tripoli. But also Turkey's close relations with Libya was meant to strengthen Turkey's arguments in Eastern Mediterranean. Similar dynamics we see the use of military instruments in Turkey's neighborhood. So, for example, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Turkey's military support for Azerbaijan, that was influential. Again, the use of military instruments in foreign policy. So just to conclude, so a few points. One, I think earthquake diplomacy can provide a new momentum if there is also a political will to, if it's accompanied by a political will to improve broken relationships or to improve relationships. The economic crisis is, I think, going to be a very important factor, both in domestic politics, but also in foreign policy. Ankara will look for investments and some stability in Turkey. I think that will have implications in terms of foreign policy initiatives as well. And we can expect to see, I think, a continuous emphasis on this notion of autonomy and a policy of balance between East and West. And I think we can also expect to see continuity in Turkey's investments in military technology, and as Ankara seeks to become a major drone power and seeks more influence in regional and international politics. I'd like to also mention that the earthquakes also devastated Syria, so there are potential also political implications in terms of international aid going into Syria, but also implications for Assad's legitimacy and politics in Syria. But that's perhaps for another event. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. So really wonderful survey and one with real content, data, depth, and analysis. I'm going to stand here because I know the online people will be able to see them a little bit better. This is a time for questions. Let me start in the room. Online people, get your questions together and put them in the Q&A, the chat there. So first, any questions in the room that we can draw from? Yes. And again, identify yourself and affiliation, please.
Hello, yeah. It's working? Yeah.
Sort of. I think.
Is it working?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay. Bernard Casey, thank you very much. I'm glad I came out this evening. 2 points, not directly relevant, but seemingly relevant. I was interested in the discussion about circumstances, mutual experiences, but also the role of individuals and their involvement. So this is largely coming up from the third presentation, which reminded me a long time ago when I was doing work in Cyprus about the relationships which prevailed or did not prevail between the effective leaders of the south part of Cyprus and the north part of Cyprus. The mere fact that these people had actually once upon a time both been in the Royal Air Force together during the Second World War, and therefore there were relationships that were at a sort of personal level which moved the Cyprus resolution. At that time people thought a bit further, but that disappeared with the individuals, and therefore I picked up on the point that you made there as that component, as much as the context, being extraordinarily important. A second one, which also comes up sort of largely from me, the third presentation. Yeah, Turkey, I'm an economist, so this is why I ask questions like this. Turkey needs capital inflows at the moment. That is highly important. One of the things you talked about, a new foreign minister, but there's also a new finance minister who has taken a very different, or appears to be taking a potentially very different position to that of his predecessors. This means that relationships they're not just political relationships, they're political economy relationships and they're economic relationships. And actually for Turkey to be able to succeed, it needs to actually build these economic relationships with the outside, because if you are putting money in, you've got to have, the presumption is you've got to have a viable economic background. So I wondered again if you could comment upon that. But thank you, it's very interesting, and all three of you, I was greatly impressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we want to, are there any other questions before in the room to add to that? Let's add one more and then we'll.
Thank you. I will ask, so I'm a fellow at the Department of Government at LSE. So I have a question a bit tangent to Dr. Gürsoy and Dr. Zihnoğlu. How do they assess the current, like a nationalist cleavage, like after the election, like a nationalist, ultranationalist sentiments in Turkish society, and how the potential implications for this, like how we can deal, because as we have seen after the election and after the earthquake, we see kind of a bit hatred against the Syrian refugees and any other refugees. So any new inflow of refugees or asylum seekers. So I was wondering how you would like to assess this. It's a bit tangent to the current discussion, but still relevant. Thank you very much.
Great. Start.
Right. Thank you very much for your question. So I would totally agree with the importance of individual leaders when it comes to rapprochement, for example. And on the second point on economy, I think that is going to be a major driver of Turkish foreign policy. Turkey needs capital inflow, and that's why I mentioned they need more stability, and that might be that might result in a softening of some rhetoric towards the West. But as you said, there's a new finance minister and a return to arguably more rational economic policies. But is it enough? I'm not sure. So in terms of a major change, in terms of really triggering capital inflow and foreign investment in Turkey. But I think it's a positive development, let's say that. But I'm a bit skeptical at the moment, but we'll see how that goes. But I think that's going to be a major driver of Turkish foreign policy.
Well, about the ultranationalism question, Sevinç, I'm going to actually quote my husband here, who is also in the audience. He's the one who does our supermarket shopping. And here is the relevance. We were talking about the rise of ultranationalism and the debates around the rise of ultranationalism in Turkish politics. And what he said to me, imagine head and shoulders. There used to be only one head and shoulders. And on the supermarket shelf, you would see all of them, but they would be in one row. Now they have head and shoulders lemon, head and shoulders, I don't know, I cannot think of anything else but lemon and
Strawberry or something.
strawberry and coconut, and then they have a bigger shelf space. But the amount of head and shoulders shampoos that you see on the market is probably the same. So I think we're witnessing something very similar. We have more political parties in these alliances. Of course, there has been a splinter from the MHP, and we see the E party in the other alliance. So this kind of gives the impression that nationalism is on the rise. So we are getting preoccupied with the political parties and the key kind of positions they hold within the alliances. But if you look at the votes, I cannot say the exact numbers off the top of my head, but if you look at the numbers of nationalistic political parties votes, there hasn't actually been an increase from 2014 onwards. But this is an important phenomenon, even though nationalist voters are not increasing in numbers, and we need to keep in mind that nationalist voters are quite a significant number in Turkish politics. That's already given. Are they on the rise or not? This is what we're questioning. And within the political parties and alliances, because they hold these key positions, they're making themselves heard more. And I think this is exactly in the question that you asked. We're seeing this with regard to attitudes towards refugees. So we're hearing them more, seeing them more, and probably they have more policy influence now and in changing people's sentiments over specific issues like the refugees. But overall, I don't want to, I cannot agree with the statement they are on the rise among Turkish population.
Did you want to add anything?
Yes, I mean, just a quick add. I think what we're seeing, I mean, I'm looking at ultranational groups within society, civil society for another project. That's why I was interested on the topic for a period. I think what we're seeing is that some of their discourse being mainstream, but I would agree with Yaprak that, I mean, since the late 1990s, maybe we're speaking about the rise of nationalism, the rise of nationalist parties in Turkey. It's not only this election, but we've been speaking about that for a very long time. But what we're seeing is their discourse, some of the claims that they're making is becoming more and more mainstream within Turkish politics. Thank you.
Great, and I've got some questions amongst the online group. Frederick Putman, LSE PhD candidate, currently based in Sciences Po. Question to Özgür. How do you explain the incident, Gazile selling tents to ABAP, yeah, and how would you describe and explain different perceptions of ABAP in Turkish society? So that's one question. Maybe we take that question now, and then I'll ask the other online question.
I mean, the incident of Kızılay, I mean, a government, publicly supported NGO selling tents or anything is, I mean, it's a corruption of, I mean, it's a mismanagement, whether to up or to anyone else.
Sorry, can you explain who Up is for us?
It's-
There are names here. There is Kisley and there is Up.
But it's a charitable organization that was established in 2017 in Turkey. It's become one of the leading NGOs, charities, distributing aid. It became one of the charities of the groups, especially opposing Erdogan or the AK party. So it raised millions of in aid.
And Kızılay is sort of like Red Cross.
Oh, okay.
So Red Cross sold tents to a civil society organization during the earthquake. So this was a huge scandal. How could they do this? They should have been a charitable organization giving these tents for free.
Well, I mean, different person, I mean, what happened was as AHBAP became the NGO where mainly the opposition groups who wouldn't trust the public institutions to send their aid, it's become the organizations where many people start sending their aid, charitable aid. And all of a sudden, I mean, it was well known, but all of a sudden it became very big. It was attracting a lot of money, much more than it was, I mean, it could attract before. And it was politicized in that way. It attracted, not politicized, but it started attracting political attention that I think it wasn't willing, it wasn't attracting before. And as it was being politicized, that we could see that political divide, the reflections being reflected on AKP as well. Those who are opposing the government were sending their money. They've seen it as a trustworthy NGO where they could send money, whereas as it became the NGO of the opposition groups, maybe, then those who were closer to government were started looking at more suspicion, with more suspicion, because then we also, as I said in my talk, we've seen the high level political figures in the government expressing their reactions, expressing their at some point even threatening up. So it became an object of that political debate, political divide in Turkey.
May I just add something to that very quickly? So one of the things that was particularly sad for me, I mean, the whole week and that month, I don't think that any one of us who had anything to do with Turkey knew how those days went, because we were glued to the news, and of course we were feeling extreme grief and desperation, and we were very saddened with what was going on. But on top of that, I felt extreme sadness because people were questioning, I cannot give my money to this organization, to that organization, or, you know, even people who were collecting money here, don't give your money or aid to this organization because they're giving to that organization. I mean, this was getting a bit ridiculous. At the end of the day, all of these organizations are giving the money back to the people. And we shouldn't be even talking about these things and trying to calculate, this was what people were doing, who to give the money to. And I think this example of AHBAP purchasing the tents from Kızılay was a very good example of how, you know, you cannot avoid state institutions in a disaster like this. It's futile to even to make that attempt because these civil organizations working on the ground will have to work with state organizations. You cannot try to find a civil society organization that doesn't work with the state. It's absolute nonsense. And so we see the effect of affective polarization, emotional polarization in a disaster like this, which shouldn't have happened. So this I just want to add that as a comment.
Could I just add another something?
Of course.
Okay, in Turkey, interpersonal trust is very low, and charitable giving is also not very high. So Turkish people in Turkey do not historically trust the civil society organizations that much. And the trust was further weakened after 2016. So already who am I going to give my money? Am I going to give my money to this charity or that charity? Was already problematic to start with. And as people's trust to public institutions wane, this became even a bigger problem in the face of, all these events that we saw after the earthquake.
Thanks. So we have another question from the online Zoom group. Selin Nasi from the Ankara Policy Center. My question is to Professor Gürsoy. Do you think the government's control of the media, and particularly its narrative of, quote, the disaster of the century, unquote, has had an impact on the voting behavior of the earthquake victims?
Yeah, thanks, Selin, for the question. And I think it did. So because I was talking about like how conflicting narratives are created. So on the one side, there was the narrative of this is a natural disaster, of the century, natural disaster of the century. And then the other one was, again, we see polarization. This is a disaster that was actually human-made, because these types of natural disasters can happen, but the buildings should be standing, and rescue teams should be in place to save the victims. The reality is a bit of both, I think. So you can, nature has something to do with it, obviously, but human negligence was there as well. So I'm looking for the data because we asked people how or from where they watched the coverage of the earthquake. And I think around 56%, if I'm not mistaken, said that they watched it from regular TV channels. So regular TV channels is still where people get their news from. And obviously, if the media, the traditional news media, is saying that this is a natural disaster of the century, it would have an impact on people. The other thing we asked people, our respondents, who they think should be blamed for the deaths in the earthquake. And so the people who gave the answer that no one is responsible, this is a natural disaster, was for AKP supporters, people who voted for the AKP, who said that this is a natural disaster, was just 15%. And so even though the media narrative is important, it was only 15% who believed that this was only because it was a natural disaster. And who did they believe was the main responsible person or people, the main culprits? And those were constructors and construction companies. Now, the numbers are actually very similar to the Turkish population in general. So the respondents, the respondents in our survey who did not vote for the AKP, the percentages are a little bit different, but still at the top comes constructors and construction companies. This is very similar to what Özge said, that people, there's no intersocietal trust. And again, this is true that these construction companies, they did not build durable buildings, and the people kind of see them as the main culprits. People who see this as a natural disaster was approximately the same for non-AKP supporters as well. So overall, I think that the media had an impact, but in terms of who's responsible for the deaths, it's not necessarily, I think, the natural disaster rhetoric that made the trick.
Can I ask something, and I'll turn it back to the audience, but given that this is really on the heels of the disaster that is has been COVID, were the trends that you saw similar to the sorts of trends in all the different presentations? In other words, distrust on civil society. I mean, there weren't electoral politics, but as various support or otherwise, international. Does Turkish society, is there some similar responses to another kind of disaster that came out of the blue?
May I ask a follow-up, because I was actually wanting to ask something precisely like that as well. And that's very interesting, because I mean that was the other thing which came up partly as a result of that second round of questions, and it reminded me of rather a long time ago when I was working at a multilateral development bank in Washington, DC, and Robert Putnam was all over the place all the time. And we were talking about social capital. This is when we sort of first discovered this. Putnam at the time, and the reason why that multilateral development bank, whose name I shall not mention, got terribly interested in social capital was because it had begun to realize that actually some of these governments it was dealing with were not very efficient, and it needed some kind of intermediary or somebody who could do the job rather better than these governments. That was what was talked about at that time. And so I was very interested in the sort of fragmentation, the low trust that you were talking about. I was also, and I mean, this is why I wanted to follow up your question. I mean, I've recently sort of published on with respect to social capital and COVID. And I mean, I had countries with indicators of social capital in my data set, and Turkey was therefore one of them, and whether that impacted upon performance in particular countries. So I think it is, I mean, I think Chris's point is very, very relevant indeed. What is actually going on? And this repeated sort of view of very low interpersonal trust, which is impacting what you were talking about the NGOs, which is impacting about what you were talking about political cleavages and political affiliations, and which talks about sort of ultimately about the kind of relationships which are likely to come out of this catastrophe and the politics which have followed from it. So thanks very much again.
We've given you a big agenda. So if you could just take that on each.
Okay, should I?
Yeah.
Okay. On the social capital, yeah, it's an important point. I mean, there are some very good, very strong, I mean, some parts of the civil society has developed incredibly over the past 10, 20, 30 years. And some parts of civil society has a long established history. But Turkish civil society is very much it's closed up in itself. So it's both ideologically, so there is probably what I would say bonding capital. So their intercommunal relations could be strong. But what we would also expect from civil society, and one of the roles we would expect from civil society to establish those bridging ties across the society. So there is no dialogue. I mean, the thing that I was focused on has been a political divide, but there's also not dialogue across the thematic areas, for instance. I mean, there are some, as I said, very good examples like the disaster platform. It brings together groups that are working across different fields on a common theme. The civil society in Turkey in general does not speak to one another ideologically and also thematically. So civil society has not been very successful in building that bridging social capital. But that's as a generalization. There are exceptions, of course. I mean, the previous question, COVID for civil society was, I mean, again, they've been very successful in rising up to the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. They quickly transformed their work. They responded very quickly and efficiently. But again, there were very good opportunities to discuss, for instance, sustainable funding. When funding, all of a sudden people were worried whether they would be able to do their projects, whether there will be any money because funding became an issue, whether there will be continued funding, external funding. And that was a moment where they could discuss that, for instance, but that was not done. So some of the opportunities, I think civil society need to be more self-reflective, but I think they're not using those opportunities. I think they missed that during the pandemic as well.
Either of you want?
Do you want to? Yeah.
All of these, I think, have an impact on foreign policy, and with regard to COVID, getting vaccines from China comes to mind. So again, Turkey can turn to its alliances in the East, relationships in the East, and again, that can be related to some personal relationships as well. But at the same time, again, it can be a result of this pursuit of autonomy, that that they can get vaccines, but also perhaps investments from the East, from the developing world. So I think that's another example of, it can have an economic impact, and that might mean Turkey looking for partnerships, not just in the West, but also using its relationships in the East, in the developing world, and non-Western sort of allies or partners of Turkey.
I'll add something very quickly to that. Buğra Güngör, who I'm collaborating with the other Buğra, has actually a paper on this that was published in 2020 in South East European and Black Sea Studies, where he looks at the data of Turkey giving medical aid during COVID-19. So as an emerging medium power, as you described, Turkey took the opportunity to give medical aid during COVID-19 as well. And this was an interesting phenomenon because Turkey itself was suffering, obviously, because from the pandemic, but still made it an important point to provide aid. And his data shows that most of the aid went to countries where Turkey had ties since the Ottoman times, and also trade ties. And it was also a good opportunity at the beginning, I think, when the West was suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic, to say, look, we are actually doing better in many respects. I wouldn't compare COVID-19 pandemic disaster with the earthquake, because I think COVID-19 was very diffuse, and it was very difficult to understand, who was buying, for what reason. I think there were more conspiracy theories back then as well, in general, globally, because you cannot see people dying, in vast numbers every day. Even though these statistics were shared, I think everybody was skeptical to a certain extent of the true numbers. Some people believe that the numbers were higher, some people believe that they were lower. And I think this happens globally, and it happens in Turkey as well. Whereas the earthquake is very visible. And one of the things that I thought in February and in March was that this is why we asked the question, do you know anybody, or have you experienced loss? Because even though only 21% of the people in our survey said that they know they've lost someone, I think everybody in Turkey knows someone who lost something or someone. So this is a completely different situation. Personally, I know several people. Half of the people I know have lost a relative. That's a huge number. But how many people do I know who passed away from COVID is actually less. And the stories behind the earthquake are more tragic. I mean, you can never compare a life lost, obviously. And they're all very painful, especially to those who are close to the people. But the earthquake's tragedy is, I think, much more devastating. And it of course, there are some really heartbreaking stories. With COVID-19, I think it was because it was diffuse, because it was for a long period of time. We also got a bit immune to the news of what was happening during the pandemic, I think. So the impact, I would say, was different, and the impact of COVID-19 on Turkish politics, was much less, or was totally forgotten about when the election period came.
Great, thank you. In the room, we have several questions now. Let me start here, back there, and then here. 3 questions. Oh, there's a 4th. Okay, 4 questions. Again, remember your name and affiliation.
Umut Kruzum from Istanbul Technical University.
Speak a little louder. It's on our end.
Okay, sorry. Umut Kruzum from Istanbul Technical University, Department of Economics. Thanks for these brilliant points. And I have a question to Yaprak Hoca. You have been mentioning about emotional waters, mostly, I think, as far as I understand, from on the side of the AKP voters. And I think that these emotions that you've been mentioning are not standing alone. They're very combined with materiality, because It's also a part of the dialectics between loss, destruction, but also reconstruction as well. I experienced the earthquake in the quake zone, and I was there. And what I've seen is like the whole city of Hatay had been ruined, like the whole loss. But then early April, I have seen that buildings had been rising, and basically people were like those basically who lost something or someone. At one point, they also, in a way, use this concept of loss and as a resource to claim for something, to demand actually. In that sense, it's also a dialectic of the emotions and imagination have been always like interrelated with the the dialectics of loss and reconstruction, or destruction, reconstruction. So in that sense, they've seen these buildings are rising there as well. And the AKP was not present in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, definitely yes, but then they were increasingly present in the field. And when the materiality is increasing, also emotions and imagination about future has also, backed very well. In that sense, would you agree with that? Like, because the emotions are always like in a way integrated with material gain. And in that sense, voters actually choose AKP for future gain in a way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the next question, that's over there.
Hi,
We have very little time, so.
fantastic. I'm also at UCL Politics. My question is also about the appointment of Mehmet Şimşek. I believe that was done in order for Erdogan to be able to re-invoke images of economic growth. However, during his first term, the three reasons that led to economic growth was the globalization of the economy and Turkey's integration into it, the zeroed out bank base rates in the West, creating FDI, and the decentralized growth leading to the Anatolian tigers. Now, if we look at the world today, we are seeing deglobalization, rising interest rates in the West, and hollowing out of capital markets, as well as the very sort of one-man policy-making approach that Erdogan has adopted. Is there a path to prosperity in this sort of, reality that he's facing?
So we're going to do 4, and there's one more on here, and I think since we're towards the end, we'll do them all in this one go. Yeah. The other is question. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes,
My name
speak
is
a little louder.
all right. My name is Kerem Akbulut. I'm a UCL computer science student. I have a question about civil society and its future in Turkey. So you mentioned sort of the interpersonal trust levels going down, especially directly after the earthquake, a lot of polarized support for different organizations, a lot of support from the government side towards APAD, and a lot of, I guess, opposition voters giving support towards APAP. But there were also some dehumanizing statements from both sides, with the Ministry of Interior back then sort of threatening APAP, saying, how dare they run parallel to the government. And then also immediately after the elections, a lot of, I guess, opposition voters were confounded and, confused about why the main AKP voter base still voting again for Erdogan, which I think sort of further expanded this divide between the main opposition and AKP supporters. How do you think this will impact future civil society activity in Turkey, and will there be another large collaboration attempt in future earthquakes, possibly to this extent, given the further divide after the earthquakes and
Great.
elections?
Thank you very much. I'm being hasty because we have actually reached post time, but we'll carry on to give you good solid answers. Yes.
Okay, so sorry, I'll be really quick. My name is Mina O'Keefe. I do this is really loud, but anyway, sorry. I do social and cultural psychology at LSE. And basically I was going to ask whether So the day Meral Akşener like left the, you know, the table of six, that was the day when, like, you know, the kind of public discourse changed in Turkey and people stopped talking about the earthquakes and they started talking about the elections. And I was wondering whether that kind of created any like negative feelings or like resentment towards the opposition, because, you know, and if that affected their votes and yeah, and like, you know, also their lack of the mentioning of the earthquakes in the campaign as well. And also, like, as our friend just asked, I was going to also ask like the reactions to the first round of the elections, you know, by the opposition to the sufferers of the earthquake, whether that also had whether that also had an effect on also, yeah, what can we see for the future in like Turkey regarding polarization and whether there is like hope for a more like united and unified Turkey, basically. Thank
And
you.
then I'll read the last one that came. Yusir, LSE MSc Finance alum. Could you please elaborate on the reasons behind the rigidity of the voters in the terms of the parties they support, as half the population states they won't give up voting for the current parties that they support under circumstances according to your study. It shows that there would be an incentive to keep using polarizing rhetoric that we've seen in political campaigns. How do you think one can break this vicious cycle? Okay. Many questions here. Please, perhaps we can start with you.
With me? I mean, I love it when one question answers the other question. So there you go. That's your answer right there. And I mean, this polarizing tactic works because I mean, there is already a block of voters for both sides. And that's a safe spot to be in. And so I don't think that political parties, maybe after the elections now, we will see less of a polarizing rhetoric for a while, but then it's going to get heightened with the next elections probably. But we'll see. We don't know what the future holds in that respect. I'll come back to your first question. So with regards to emotional voters and material interests, yes, absolutely, I agree with you. My last slide was actually a little bit on that. So I was saying that government promises and its performance was much better. I mean, you gave a concrete time period and example from Hatay from April onwards, and I think things have changed. And I think the government's promises of rebuilding houses in 1 year was incredible. And definitely there was this, and I like the way you've put, you know, how the emotions about the future hope, you know, I think this is a little bit about that. When we talk about emotions, we talk about love, anger, hope, and these are all, you know, kind of emotions that can be used for political purposes. So it is entirely possible that the AKP gave more hope and to its supporters in the earthquake regions. I would agree with that. And then your question, Mina, about the Meral Akşener leaving the table. People, I mean, this is a very precise moment, so it would be very difficult for me to say. But let me be frank with you. When the earthquake happens, one of the things that I said, people will forget about this. Because we've seen this happening over and over again, because maybe too many disasters seem to happen back to back. I think society has become oblivious to disasters like the COVID-19 pandemic as well. We've already, I mean, it was last year that there was the, the Omicron variant, and there we were actually doing our lectures and discussion sessions online. What happened to that? We've already forgotten about it. I think this is like the new generation, new consumption, social media. We consume everything very quickly. I knew this was going to happen. When Sobura came up with the idea of organizing an event, I said, let's wait after the elections. People will forget about the earthquake. We need to remind them of the disaster that has ensued. So I think it is our job to keep people reminding. I don't know why the opposition parties did not, talk about the earthquake more. I really don't know what the logic was behind that. Perhaps they were trying to give love and talk about peace, and they didn't want people to remember the pain and the disaster, but that was a fact of life. And it is very possible that the earthquake victims did not like being forgotten about. I think perhaps that was a strategic mistake.
Thank you very much. Well, first thing, clarification, interpersonal trust levels have always been very low, but that doesn't mean, and that doesn't necessarily have to translate that charitable giving will be low. Turkish people give in different ways. They give zakat, they give to their neighbors, their poor relatives. It just means that they don't give, they give to the people that they know, mostly in person. So they don't trust the institutions, they don't trust the NGOs. About the future, it's about the maturing of the civil society. We're clearly seeing that kind of maturity moving on in civil society, but they are reproducing, they are affected and reproducing that polarization. If polarization is very intense and very much at the political level, it's very difficult for civil society to dissociate itself from that. Now, there are some very good initiatives, but another problem of Turkish civil society is that its penetration is very low. So whatever good things that civil society in Turkey is doing does not necessarily translate into society, Turkish society, because they don't really penetrate as much in Turkey as we see in Western countries.
Just to respond to your question very briefly. I think it's very early to say whether the new finance minister will achieve in terms of the economy, the objectives for the economy, and the financial markets like stability. So we'll see whether it is going to be provided. He has the expertise, so I think he knows the right path. Whether he'll be able to pursue those policies and we will see how it goes, but I think it can have a foreign policy implication. You can attract investments from the West, but you can also attract from countries like China, and that may not necessarily involve some political conditionality, for example. So Turkey might pivot towards the West, but also might try alternatives in the East. So we'll see how that goes.
All right, thank you. Actually, before I and all of us thank our speakers, I'd like to mention, of course, we're talking about the earthquake and millions of earthquake victims remain and need our support today. So there are several charities you can donate to. If you're based in the UK, Disasters Emergency Committee, DEC, the Turkey-Syria Earthquake Appeal is still active. You can donate to the Turkey Mosaic Foundation, which is a UK-based charity established to support Turkish civil society organizations. So there are a number of options open to you. We hope you do give and give generously. And then let's thank all of our speakers who've given of their time, knowledge to all of us. And then so thank you very much. And then, of course, thank both all of you in the room and our friends in the Zoom room for joining us. So thank you very much. Have a good evening. For those of you who are here, there's a reception outside. Thank you.